Hello and welcome to another episode of Reinventing School. We do this every week, every Thursday. And this time through, we're going to talk about a topic that we really haven't even mentioned in this series, and that is how we assess, how we evaluate, how we test, how we figure out whether or not what we're doing in the effort in moving towards learning is actually causing productive results. And if it is, how much, what kind, how do we figure that out? Evaluating anything is really hard because you need a proper sample size. You need to make sure that the regimen that you're using to figure out what you want to know matches what you actually want to know, and ways to report it. This has become an enormous industry in the education space. It's very confusing about what ought to be done, how that information ought to be used, and to some extent also whether privacy enters into this. Because if I'm going to take a test, I would prefer that information stay with me and not really with the school or anything else. I don't want it in my permanent record that I failed the test. I think that's information that should be used by me so I can learn better. So there's a lot of issues that are fairly complicated here, and we're going to dig in fairly deep. So we have two guests this week, and both of them are pretty knowledgeable about this and fairly opinionated as well. So this should be an interesting look at what we want to try to grab here. One is Jeff Snyder, and the other is Alfie Kohn. Both names may be familiar to you. Rather than my doing specific introductions, we'll follow our usual custom and just ask Jeff and then Alfie. So where are you? Tell us a bit about yourself before we get into the deep conversation. Jeff.
Well, thank you so much for having both of us. I am coming to you from St. Paul. I'm a professor at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota. It's a small liberal arts college, about 2,000 students. My background is I'm a historian of education, focusing on the modern 20th century United States schooling system. And I just started teaching a first year seminar. I think this is the 8th iteration I've done, which is called Will This Be on the Test? Standardized Testing in American Education, that looks at testing basically from kindergarten all the way to college.
Thank you. Alfie?
I'm coming to you from the Boston area, where I work on my own, writing books and articles, and in the old days, giving in-person lectures and workshops, now two-dimensional. And I tend to write and speak about a range of issues in human behavior, as well as education and parenting specifically. And my education interests include challenging the use of grades and tests, as well as other aspects of traditional education, moving toward an approach that's more student-centered, more about understanding than merely memorizing facts, and that puts students at in the center.
Cool, thank you. Let me jump over to, because you have to have a starting place here somewhere. My first exposure to tests, and maybe this will allow Jeff to talk a little about the history, is the idea of having a pre-test, New York City public schools, followed by a post-test. So I was surprised as I started going to other schools that people didn't do pre-tests, because I sort of remember the form we use and everything else. It seemed to me, and it still does, that makes sense for me to first figure out how much do I know about the subject. And then after doing a bunch of learning, somebody would ask me, well, do you know more now? So give us a sense of how that fits into the history of what evaluation is all about. And obviously I'm super simplifying that.
So the pre-test element is interesting, right? And I don't know exactly when that would have first originated, but you had modern standardized testing. It's about 100 years old. It grows out of the original IQ tests, intelligence tests. I think there's an interesting element of the pre-test feature that you mentioned, which is an attentiveness to growth, which is something that you have to be intentional about, to say, hey, we're going to do a pre-test. We're going to try and get a read on the student's current level of knowledge on this particular subject. And then, 6 months later, 8 months later, whatever it is, do a post-test and see how much they've learned. So I think, I'm not sure when that would have originated, but that sort of baseline pre-testing would be very, very common today, certainly across states.
Alfie, thoughts?
Well, I don't have thoughts about the historical background of it, but what I would point out is the enormous oversimplification that uses a kind of dipstick model, you know, like in a car where you see how much is in then before and then after, and then you subtract and you've got growth. This represents a kind of, well, century-old, obsolete mechanism for understanding learning, even before you get to evaluating it, that assumes that kids are empty receptacles into which knowledge is poured that you can then measure to see how much was there at each point. But what we know now is that real learning is a process of actively constructing meaning, not merely about receiving a bunch of facts or skills. And tests, especially but not limited to standardized tests, are not only unnecessary for assessing real understanding, they don't do it very well inherently. Tests measure what matters least, intellectually speaking. And that's before you even get to certain of the worst kind of tests, such as those that are multiple choice, those that are timed, those that are standardized and thus are really not about capturing what students understand and how teachers teach. If the test is standardized, the fundamental objective here is to compare, to create a kind of contest to see who's better than whom, which students, which teachers, which schools, which districts, which countries are defeating others. If you were interested in the learning itself, you would never need to standardize it so that everybody's doing the same thing under the same conditions. So what standardized tests do in practice is to make mediocre teaching look impressive. And we have data showing that some of the most thoughtful students with the deepest understanding of ideas don't tend to do that well necessarily on standardized tests.
Let me
and
stop.
Conversely, some who are not very impressive may do very well.
Let's move away from standardized tests for a minute.
Okay.
For a minute, we'll get there. I'm just talking about here's me as a kid in a classroom. So I want to shift to a different personal learning experience. Learning to draw in an art class. Mm-hmm. Now, there's no pre-assessment. There is in front of me something that I have to attempt to draw. I begin to draw. The teacher wanders behind us. Every once in a while, the teacher pops in saying, you might want to have another look at that line because I'm not sure your angle is right, or you're going too dark, or whatever it is. And maybe a few more times, the teacher will provide feedback. At the end, occasionally there'll be a crit. Everybody and all the students will put up their work on a board, and then the other students will say, well, this is working for me, this is not working for me. You might want to try doing this. Very supportive environment typically, sometimes competitive, but usually very supportive. There's no pre-test. There's no post-test. There's in-process instruction. And it's a very different experience. Now, as we think about machine learning and the future of connecting learning process technology and evaluation or assessment, that seems like a very different model from the original classroom pre-test, post-test. So and you see I'm beginning to build some blocks here, and then we'll figure out what the whole fortress looks like. So what do you think, when I talk about that, is that a good model? Is it a good model only for art class or for music or for other purposes?
Well, Jeff, do you want to
No, go ahead, Alfie.
You've actually tangled together several distinct differences that for that model, which we should probably untangle here. Well, one is they're not taking any kind of written test. That makes sense for most things where if we are interested in what students can do, not just the facts that they've memorized. Second, there's a dialectical relationship in what you describe between the evaluation and the teaching. That seems to me like a good idea too, rather than drawing a sharp line. Okay, now you've finished learning. We're going to see how much you know. In great classrooms, we've known this for 60 years, the best teachers never give tests. For two reasons. First, because, as I said, tests measure what matters least, but second, because they don't need it. They're getting a constant stream of information, like your hypothetical art teacher, about what kids understand, where they need help, where there's a gap, and so on. Third, you indicated that this art teacher was offering evaluation, and that's interesting. We should possibly look at that for all fields and ages to see how much the teacher needs to judge as opposed to offering feedback, which is not evaluative, but merely describes what the teacher has noticed. And there are other aspects of this as well. At the end, how can we gather together what the student has? And just as art students and professional artists and architects collect a portfolio of what they've done, so many teachers have a portfolio which ideally must replace grades and tests, not be used to yield them. And I think there are some other aspects there too, which have made more or less relevance, but that's a starting point.
Okay, Jeff?
Yeah, I just want to flag and bracket. I think I'd love to ask Alfie a question a little bit later about content and expertise. But to build on what he was just saying in your question, Howard, I think the form of assessment that you described has three elements, all of which I believe are related to what Alfie just said. One is that it's iterative, right? It doesn't just happen at a single point in time or even just a pre-test and a post-test. It's ongoing. It's collaborative, right? It involves the student herself, peers, a teacher, perhaps with an art critique, maybe an outside expert of some sort. And then an element that I think is essential, the third element, is that it is metacognitive. And what I mean by that is that would encourage students and their peers to be aware of their own work, to be aware of the feedback that they're receiving, how they might incorporate it, to be more strategic in terms of this is where I am with my skill set in terms of drawing, let's say. Here are things I need to think about, whether that's shadow or angle or an expression of emotion. So I think that for me, an ideal form of assessment would not simply be external to the student, where you get kind of a piece of paper that's just got numbers on it. I do think there's value to those pieces of paper, but at its highest level, I would say that assessment involves that kind of self-awareness, those metacognitive skills for you to be able to evaluate your own progress. And that to me seems like it should be an essential component of any really high quality, sophisticated assessment system.
So I'm using the words evaluation, assessment, and testing as almost synonymous. And I have a feeling I shouldn't be doing that. Can you break it down?
No, because testing, as I keep saying, is a peculiarly ineffective and unnecessary version. A lot of times in schools these days, teachers refer to, we're going to have an assessment next week, kids. And all they mean is a test, because no one's ever invited them to think about all the more authentic and constructive ways by which we can assess that do not involve tests. So yeah, we need to be, I think, careful about the language. If I can build on two things that Jeff just said that captured me. One is in bringing students in on the process, which I think is absolutely vital that he's describing. We need to invite students to think about the goals, not just how successful they've been at meeting the goals. What are we looking for here? What constitutes success? We should be doing, as the best teachers do, more asking and less telling. What are the criteria, rather than just asking the kids to evaluate themselves according to criteria that have been imposed upon them? But the second thing, and here I want to be a little more subversive here, is to push back a little about the problems of overdoing metacognitive stuff and any kind of assessment, including that involves the kids themselves. Educational psychology for the last few decades has come up with a really important distinction between learning and performance. The learning is about what students are doing. The performance is about how well they're doing it. And research has shown half a dozen substantial problems with getting students to become too focused on how well they're doing, even using more advanced, thoughtful, enlightened approaches than grades and tests. When kids come in and their main question is, how good am I at doing this? Have I made improvement? They tend to become less engaged with the learning itself. They tend to become less likely to want to do challenging things. They'll want to keep it simple because then they'll be more likely to be successful. They tend to be less likely to think deeply and to look at things in a shallow way. And there are other emotional and social costs. Okay. So I worry about students who are then asked to be more metacognitive, like little kids thinking about how good they are at reading, which tends to make them less engaged with the story itself. Only occasionally and very carefully should we ask students to be thinking about how good they are at the task and do anything evaluative. Most of the time, I believe, especially, but not exclusively younger students, they should be completely engaged in the doing.
All right, so let me ask a question that's going to sound a little bit tangential, but you'll see why it's not. You guys see Hamilton?
Mm-hmm. Haven't seen it. Listen to the soundtrack.
Okay, you've listened to the music. You've seen the Disney film, yeah?
I have not.
Have you seen the play? It's kind of what I'm getting at. You've not. Okay. Alfie, you have?
I just saw it on the TV, the televised version, yeah, okay. of the stage show.
Pretty well known, yeah? Yes. So Lin-Manuel Miranda is in a challenging situation. He's trying to tell a part of American history based upon what he learned from a book he read and from whatever other knowledge and whatever else he brings. And clearly the marketplace has evaluated that with very, very high honors, yes? How do we assess that? How do we assess the work, not the success? How did he do? Nobody mentioned James Monroe. I think we should probably take him down a half a point for that. Like, how does it work? So here's a very popular, very good work about something that is studied in school. How did he do? And how do you figure out how well he did? And does it matter how well he did?
Well, by what criteria? His accuracy in rendering that period of American history, his success at getting people interested in history, the aesthetic accomplishments, the extent to which he rhymed the songs well, the production values of it. I mean, we could go on and spin out various criteria and then evaluate it. So the first question is, what do we mean by successful and which of those criteria matter more?
Okay, now let's take Lin-Manuel, thank you, and put him into, when would you study that? 10th grade? Something like that, right?
Study
Alexander Hamilton.
Oh, Hamilton.
Study the Revolution in some detail. I think it's 10th. Somebody will correct us. If you had judged him, or if we attempted to judge him, based upon what he knew and what he was telling us about Alexander Hamilton, he might not have gotten it all right. He might have gotten some context wrong. He may have taken liberties to be able to get attention. He may have constructed the story so that it had a central focus on a particular character, whether or not he got all the facts right. So he hands in a report. How do you assess it? I would apply all the same criteria, Alfie, that you just listed. There's no way that I would say, well, you did I'd say it depends. What are you trying to achieve? And I don't know that I would judge Lin-Manuel on on the same scale that I would judge Jill Lepore, who happened to be sitting next to him in class. I don't know that I would judge him differently from, I mean, pick it out. Every student is going to come at something in a very different way. And so wouldn't they deserve a different form of assessment? Depends on who you are, depends on what you're trying to accomplish. I don't want to be judged by the same criteria as the person who's next to me who's just so good at drawing. So are we both going to get graded? I learned more. I'm the most improved puppy in the class, which was, by the way, something that during dog training, my dog was terrible, but they did give her the most improved puppy certificate. So I've always thought about that as a wonderful metaphor for, is the purpose of school to move you as far as possible along a learning spectrum, or for you to get as much as you can out of it? And by the way, I don't necessarily care about every subject I'm learning in school, but some I do care about a lot. So how do you assess that or evaluate that, and certainly leave me alone with tests, but we'll get to that in a minute.
First, we should distinguish between having different criteria for understanding the success of a history report with the fact that students come in with different interests and talents. The latter may be true, but we may nevertheless be asking them to think about how well they understood history rather than the other possible criteria applied to a Broadway show about history, which has
think about it as a story about Alexander Hamilton, not as a fancy Broadway show. It's a report on Hamilton.
Okay, well, we certainly don't need to give grades. I want to be clear about that. Grades do nothing but damage, and I'll say more about why and what the research, if you want me to. Plus, grades would only compound the kind of differences or challenges that you alluded to with students who have different goals, different backgrounds, and so on. But bringing students in to think about the criteria before we ask them to write a history report makes a lot of sense to me. What are we all looking for here? Let's think about that. And then let's offer qualitative feedback when we're done based on a range of the very criteria that the students themselves came up with to honor their input as well as the diversity that everybody's not in here looking for the same thing. Jeff, do you disagree with that, or what would you add to that?
No, it makes sense for me in terms of making the criteria transparent, and could be helpful to do that with students depending on their level of maturity. I think making assessment criteria transparent would be the first step in terms of developing a more thoughtful, sophisticated assessment system.
And who's developing those criteria?
Well, it depends on what kind of assessment you're speaking about. In some cases it would be individual teachers in individual classrooms. They have their sophomore, final report on Alexander Hamilton, and they're going to generate some sort of rubric, often, right? Uses 3 or more sources, makes compelling arguments, cites the material appropriately. So, I think on an individual classroom level, you'd have teachers generating their own criteria. For more standardized assessments or school-wide assessments, then you'd have groups of teachers, school administrators.
Let's go back. I don't want to go too quickly through this.
Yeah.
So you said that there are specific criteria. Did I use more than 3 sources? Were they okay? So that's process. I suppose that good, solid process is a good thing, right? We want to make sure everybody can follow a reasonable process so that we all can feel as though they've done the work and all. That's different from, I decided to write a rap song about it. That's a very, so are you judging me on my music, on my presentation, on my collection of material, or are you judging me on a very strict group of, did you write this neatly, essentially? So if you didn't write it neatly and I can't read it, can't really help you. That's not something you're going to have to do it again. But if you're going to do it differently from me because you learn differently from me and because you perceive the world differently from me, it seems to me as long as we all kind of check a few different items. Yeah, I said I was going to write a book about, report on Alexander Hamilton. If I decided to write a book about armadillos instead, you'd have reason to sit down with me. But if I said, you know what, Alexander Hamilton is actually the less interesting part of the story. Aaron Burr is actually the more interesting part of the story. So I'm going to mention Hamilton, but it's really Burr that provides the model for a man in that era. Much stronger land speculator, much more of a political player, actually did become vice president, got taken down by a political process. He's a more interesting story. So if I'm
this is where you get
story,
to the transparency again. The students are in conversation with one another and the teacher as they're doing it. I'm checking in. Can this be about the whole period, not just about Hamilton? Can this be a rap song instead of a paper? You know, it's, I mean, I'm not sure it creates that much of a puzzle. And then together we decide what constitutes an acceptable way of discharging what it is that I know and reflecting on it further. If I'm a teacher and I have somebody who says, I think Burr's should be in the foreground here, I'm seeing a kid who's getting engaged with this, and I say, go to it, you know, knock yourself out. If I have somebody say, I want to do, you know, a rap about it instead of a paper, then I say, well, let's check in though about what the criteria are for assessing the effectiveness. To what extent do you want to be evaluated based on how good your rap is, as opposed to how many details you incorporated about the period of history and how accurately you did so. So there's no surprise at the end by saying it's more of this and less of that.
No, wait, no, I'm a smart student, and I'm gonna push back and say, what do you want me to accomplish here? Do you want me to learn about the people, important souls in the American Revolution? If you do, leave me alone and let me figure this out. And you're gonna say as teacher, but I have to put a number in a box. I have to report.
Well, that's a problem right away.
And I'm going to say to you, my interest is in learning. Your problem, teacher, being with all due respect, is putting a number in a box. I'm not really interested in your number in the box because I'm going to do just fine. I'm going to do what I'm going to do regardless of the results of this particular exercise. But I'm really interested in Aaron Burr and the relationship with Alexander Hamilton. Leave me alone and let me do it. Am I just being an obnoxious, iconoclastic student? Or
no, you're absolutely right as the student, because you've brought us now to a different point, which is not the same as the criteria we were talking about and thinking about what aspect of this you do and what modality or genre or whatever. You're now asking about quantifying the results. And I think that what this student just said is 100% correct, if I may quantify the percentile of correctness here. When you use letters or numbers to evaluate what students are doing, you undermine the learning as well as give a faux objectivity to what is fraught with subjectivity necessarily. I hate rubrics even more than I hate grades because they offer multiple criteria so that kids are no longer thinking about what aspect of history is the most compelling here and what role should Burr play. They're thinking, does this get a 4? We have undermined their excitement about what they're doing and the depth of their engagement, which is why I urge teachers and schools to ungrade their classrooms, even to the extent they're compelled still with a somewhat benighted status quo institutions to turn in a grade for kids at the end of the term.
All right, so the obvious question is, then why do you do it? And we're going to address that right after this break. welcome back. We're going to be doing some interesting things in the next few weeks related to positive education, which is where education and positive psychology meet up. So we're going to be having a half-hour episode followed by an hour episode next week. And then we'll do another from Australia with some experts there the following week. And then later in the month of October, we'll be joined by not only the person who runs the school in Australia, completely related to positive psychology, but also a whole bunch of students. So that's where we're heading. But for right now, we are talking about why so much emphasis, so much of the design of, I'm going to say US education, but overall, I guess education throughout the world seems to be so obsessed with assessment, which seems largely for those above the kid, but don't necessarily have a whole lot to do with the life of a child, a student. So it seems to me this is a gigantic mess that ought to be undone. Alfie, I have a feeling you would agree with that. Jeff, how did we get here?
Well, I mean, I do think there's an element that we haven't described before. So if it's going to be, if you're talking about a real obsession or fixation or concentration on quantitative assessment and metrics, I think one thing that we haven't mentioned yet, which is vital, is the accountability movement, and also discussions about the achievement gap. So, you know, over the past 40 years, there's been this move to look at student test scores and think about, hey, what are the disparities that we're seeing in terms of race? What are the disparities we're seeing in terms of socioeconomic status, in terms of English language learner status? So I think that there's a huge push from a really interesting coalition of people ranging from, Democrats and Republicans to civil rights organizations like the NAACP, who are strongly in favor of accountability-based assessments as a civil rights tool, as a way to both identify achievement gaps, right? You have these different student populations and they're performing at very different levels. We should be aware of that. And we should hold teachers, principals, school systems accountable. So I think there's a whole bunch of reasons why numbers, we're so obsessed with numbers in the United States. But I think one part of this story here is metrics. And so if I could, I'd generally be curious to hear Alfie's take on this. If I think about something like disparities in health outcomes, right? How do we know that kids who are poor aren't doing as well in terms of their health outcomes? We go out and we have certain tests, whether that's a test of the degree of exposure to lead, whether that's rates of asthma, whether that is rates of childhood obesity. And so you create this data set and you look across populations, and you say, hey, it turns out that low-income kids are exposed to lead at a rate that's 3 times that of middle school kids. So I think there's been a genuine effort. I don't know if Alfie would see it as genuine, it might see it as cynical, but I think it's been a genuine effort on the part of many policymakers, activists, educators, to take that kind of equity lens and use testing as a tool to promote equity. So one of the things I'd be curious to hear from Alfie is, what do you say to all those people, including many civil rights groups, who have argued that you need this kind of testing in order to pursue a more equitable educational system, and indeed in order to reveal that there are these massive disparities, whether that's in terms of health or educational outcomes or any other important social metric?
Well, how to keep this brief. First, to answer Howard's question, I think overwhelmingly the preoccupation with measurement has predated and goes well beyond and is often irrelevant to the civil rights movement that you speak of, Jeff. It comes from a long-standing American push to sort people, to turn into contests what should not be contests. As I said before, the only reason to standardize a test really is to be able to say who's doing better than whom. If you were just interested in learning, you would never need that. As Linda McNeil at Rice University said some years ago, measurable outcomes may be the least significant results of learning. And when you begin to quantify it, you actually distort that which you are purporting to measure. So whenever somebody asks me, if we don't have tests, how are you going to measure success? I always say, can we change the verb here? I'm okay with assess, as long as we do it sparingly and carefully. But measurement is part of the problem. Now, there are people who are genuinely concerned about the gap and so on. But I think one does not have to be cynical to realize that, for example, the Many Children Left Behind Act was started by people whose clear purpose was not to improve the educational or other situation of people of color or low-income folks. Their clear interest, and we have documentation of this in the Bush administration, in the Heritage Foundation, which is where this came from, not from the NAACP. They co-opted civil rights groups into believing this was going to help kids of color when it did exactly the opposite. But the overwhelming objective of this whole top-down, test-driven, corporate-styled accountability movement was to privatize as much of public education as possible. And I write about that at length if you're interested. Now, the civil rights groups were often signed on to this because, of course, the fact that there are inner city kids, you know, getting a second-rate education is outrageous, morally and in every other way. So for 20 years, I have been challenging proponents of this movement to find a single school or district where we didn't know that the kids were getting an inferior education until we battered them with standardized tests. In every single case, we already knew. Now, there may have been some need to quantify with respect to the extent to which lead, you know, to take your healthcare metaphor, is destructive or something like that. But here we run into the problem of what philosophers call question begging, which means assuming to be true precisely what we have to demonstrate, which in this case is that the act of learning is analogous to the count of pathogens in your bloodstream. I would argue that what has happened as a result of this, intentionally in many cases, unintentionally for genuine civil rights activists and proponents and organizers, is that kids in inner city communities who are getting a second-rate education are now getting a third-rate education, and the quality of the teaching and learning has declined as the test scores have risen. And this is why it's so critical to understand just how misleading standardized test results are. It is not only possible, but likely that you will reduce the quality of what goes on in a classroom when you take the test prep strategies that are being desperately taken in a high-stakes environment to raise the scores, not improve the learning, raise the scores. So the more focused you are on these metrics, the more likely it is that you're going to undermine exactly what it is you're trying to promote. And so we've had kids being driven out of school who, because everything rests on a test score at the end, 12 years of academic accomplishments are irrelevant if they can't pass the final test. They see the writing on the wall, they drop out. That's in the name of raising the bar, in the name of closing the gap. We've taken these measures that have also pushed out some of our finest teachers who are also being judged, not based on the quality of teaching and learning, but on how well they prepare kids to do well on a standardized test. So if my kid's school sees a rise in test scores beyond which what we predict by socioeconomic status, which by the way accounts for 80 to 90% of test score variation, I'm going to run in if I see the test scores going up and say to the principal, oh no, what did you have to sacrifice from my kid's education in order to make that happen? And it's a hell of a lot more likely that more will be sacrificed in a school of African Americans and Latino kids.
So I just want to clarify a few points, and I think I probably agree with about 75% of what Alfie just said. Just to clarify, I think that No Child Left Behind, which was the law of the land from 2002 to 2015, has been an abject failure. But I think that I would want to make a distinction between, I feel like maybe I'm not going to put words in your mouth, Alfie, but perhaps an intrinsic opposition to testing, and what I would say is my opposition to testing in terms of the way that it's applied. So one of the reasons that No Child Left Behind was such a disaster and a miserable failure, especially for low-income kids and Black and brown kids, was the high-stakes nature of the assessment. And that relates to everything that Alfie talked about in terms of all the problems that you saw across the United States with, too much teaching to the test. If it's possible that your school is going to be shut down, because you had 3 or 4 years where you haven't achieved what was called adequate yearly progress in terms of your test results improving, of course, you're going to be obsessed and take a by any means necessary approach to raising those test scores. And that's going to lead to asinine developments like cutting recess, like cutting out all of the other subjects that exist to focus purely on English language arts and math. So I'm in wholehearted agreement with Alfie that the high stakes nature of the No Child Left Behind tests was a great and horrific perversion of educational objectives and intent. I do think that there's a way in which you can have these kinds of baseline tests, what do you want, proficiency tests that aren't connected to such high stakes consequences that are then enormously valuable as comparative data. Because sure, we can make certain assumptions that if you live in a poor neighborhood, the quality of schooling there is probably not going to be as high, but in the same way that we need hard data, as limited as it may be, I think it's of enormous value for people to be able to point to average differences in test scores. Again,
let me ask you a question.
Sure.
So in the Philadelphia area, I visited a lot of schools in a lot of different places. I'm sure you guys have too. One idea was, let's take some of the kids from the city and bring them out to a suburb, and they can all share ideas and talk about their lives and all that. And the bus full of kids from the city, on the way back, I wasn't there, but a friend was, the kids all looked at each other and go, we're done. We're toast. It was so obvious to this group of ninth graders, I think, that the resources, the quality of the teachers, the quality of the facility, the quality of the education was so far superior to anything they could imagine. And that there really was, there's no point in testing that. Let's stop taking so much time to worry about this, what seems to me, based on what we're talking about here, to be minutia, and let's fix the equity problem and then test. The idea that we're testing knowing that things are profoundly wrong, it gives you maybe a little bit of a margin for we could do this a little better or that a little better, but we are so bad at so many things, and students are so unhappy because all of this is so far, and teachers are too, because it's so much out of their control. So how do we shift the conversation, or should we, from let's evaluate everything to we know a lot of what's wrong. How about if we fix it and then deal with the degrees to which we can be better? I'm a little mystified by why this conversation exists, but I certainly understand that it has become a very large business and a very key part of how legislators think. So
legislators, like business people, tend to think in numerical terms. To come back to your original statement about a question about quantification. They measure return on investment, profitability, number of votes. They tend to think everything can be reduced to numbers. There's a whole book about how this is a uniquely American phenomenon of thinking you can and should quantify everything. So Howard, I agree with you. Most of our conversation should be about the egregious disparity in resources. It's obscene to be offering the same test to people who have been presented with far, far different approaches to education and money for funding it. Absolutely agreed. But when it comes time to do some kind of assessment, taking into account the disparity in resources, it needn't involve tests, which is still part of this positivist notion that the dipstick that I mentioned before, which in turn is based on the idea that what we're really evaluating is number of facts or skills that have been acquired before versus after. I don't think those comparisons are ever useful. Jeff and I are agreed that the high stakes nature of No Child Left Behind is just awful and is not only a failure, it was designed to be a failure. I don't know if we agree.
But it's also some time ago and it's not here anymore, right?
But
what's that?
Howard,
Well, the same sensibility persists. But I think my point is, I go further. I believe that standardization is not a useful tool for promoting equity or excellence. And standardized tests inherently are problematic as indicators of intellectual proficiency, even when the damage is not compounded with a high stakes approach to it. I'm much more interested in authentic assessment, which some schools are doing, even more individual teachers are doing, where they never give a test of their own and they do everything possible to push back on the inherently destructive effects of standardized testing. This is the difference between what you could call a liberal critique and a radical critique. The liberal one says, we've just done it badly. If we had done it more clearly, then we could measure kids up the wazoo, we could test them as long as they're good tests and as long as we don't hit them over the head when they fail. I'm saying we need to revisit these assumptions about pedagogy, about curriculum, about assessment, about the psychology of learning that drive all tests to be at best pointless and at worst destructive in their impact on education.
And by the way, individual learning, right? And by the way, we've just introduced this whole other idea of each of us being somewhat on our own, somewhat reliant upon technology, learning in smaller groups because of pandemic pods, whatever. So without standardization, a student like me is like, thank you, good. I'm going to now write my musical about, pick the person, right? I think the best thing that happens to the next Lin-Manuel Miranda, and we want more of them, is he gets to follow the path that he wants. And I mean, the randomness of him picking up the Ron Chernow book and ending up with something magnificent, this is how things happen. They don't happen as a result of standardization, except the guy who put the cap on my tooth recently, bring on the standardization. I don't want him inventing what he's doing while he's carving a tooth in my mouth.
Although there is a difference between standardized teaching, whether everybody has to learn the same thing in the same way, and whether you standardize the assessment. Theoretically,
but wouldn't it make sense that they're siblings? If we're all gonna learn the same thing and we want to know how we did, we would test it in the same way.
Yeah, they're connected in that if you use standardized tests as the outcome measure, you're going to force more standardization in the curriculum and in the standards, which is exactly what we've seen. So I think in addition to the narrow test prep stuff, which will always be done when standardized tests of any kind are the outcome measure, you're also seeing a narrowing of the curriculum.
Right.
And it's not just that it's standardized, though you're right, I think that it is, and that's the bad thing. It also tends to be, we tend to do more of the teaching that lends itself to being measured, to being reduced to numerical terms. And that's a bad thing, even if it weren't standardized. And that always happens when the outcome measure is numerical, that you're then going, I mean, look, how can I put this? It's easier to measure the number of times a student uses a semicolon correctly than it is to measure the wonderfulness of her ideas. So the more you're focused on numerical outcomes in your evaluation, the more likely you're going to be teaching the stuff that's thinner and lends itself to being quantified. And that's not just some theoretical argument. That's exactly what's happened to schools over the last generation or two, where my books are filled not only with the studies, but with stories of teachers who used to do phenomenal, rich, engaging, student-centered stuff, units that kids remember for the rest of their lives. And the more they're pressured to show numerical success, the more their teaching has to be reduced to the kind of stuff that's more readily quantifiable.
So,
you know?
Jeff,
Yeah.
Is this where we want to be? Is there another place to go? Is there a way to get there?
I'm thinking about this from the perspective of a parent. I think that there's something interesting in a lot of things that are interesting in terms of what Alfie is saying, that these kinds of standardized metrics are imperfect, that they are oftentimes a bit crude, they have limitations. But to my mind, that's not a reason to dispense with them. It seems to me that they can provide a sort of baseline, and you can build on much more sophisticated, complex assessments in addition to kind of some basic tests. So
let's use Alexander Hamilton as an example. So I got a 10th grader who's interested in Hamilton, wants to shift over to Burr, and that's going to be the capstone project for that semester. And we're now meeting with parents.
Yeah.
Tell me how that would work in that specific social studies instance.
I mean, to me, that's about encouraging student autonomy more so than it is necessarily about assessment per se.
But it's based on a grade. I'm Linmanuel Miranda's parents, and I'm going, well, I don't understand why you gave him a C. Well, but you have to understand that the basic assignment was X, Y, Z. It's like, yeah, but he won a Pulitzer Prize. We don't care.
Yeah, I mean, I guess part of the question is how many Lin-Manuel Mirandas are there in the world? But if I may just for a second to
please
channel my parent. I've got two boys. My inner parent. I've got two boys who are 10 and 6. Right, and in the state of Minnesota, we have these Minnesota comprehensive assessments. Right, it happens in math, English language arts, and then occasionally in science. And I actually find them enormously helpful from a parental level, because they give you some basic information, right? You have the 4th grade math curriculum, and you have this, does not meet, partially meets, meets and exceeds kind of the standards. I think that I went and looked at some of these tests yesterday, right? They're not absolutely brilliant. They're not riveting, but they're not garbage. And when I think about the stunning level of scientific illiteracy that we have in the United States right now, I went and I looked at the science exam for 4th graders. There's a chart. It asks you to look at trends in rainfall over time. It then asks you subsequent questions to make inferences. How might this affect the migratory patterns of birds? How might this affect the agriculture sector? It involves inferences. It involves reading. It involves a kind of a skill of reading this graph correctly. These are skills that I would defy any parent who actually cares about their children's futures, not just in terms of a job, but for them to have some ability to read and understand the world, to say that, hey, if my student bombed this test, I think it's meaningless. I think it's disingenuous to take that point of view. So for me, when I look at these scores, I'm saying, okay, this is giving me some good foundational information. If my kid is doing really poorly in a particular area, that will flag that for me. When I go to talk to the teacher, I'm not just going to take out the MCAS results and kind of look at pie charts and percentile ranks, there's going to be a different conversation. And my child is also getting intensive feedback from, say, their English teacher on their writing that's more open-ended, that's more organic, they're having conversations. So to me, the testing is one component. If that's all you're doing, you have a crazily crude version of assessment. But without that, I think that your average parent wants to have some sense of how my student is doing. And so in these tests, they show the school average, the district average, and the state average, right? And their percentile ranks. Again, I'm not fixating or obsessing over them, but I find it very helpful, especially in terms of trends over time. I've noticed, for instance, that, okay, with respect to interpretation of literature, right? Creative writing, my son maybe has been struggling over the past 2 or 3 years. That informs maybe the kind of books that I read with him, the kinds of questions that I ask. But if I don't have that information, I'm not necessarily going to notice that there's this element of his learning that could be improved.
Well, a couple of things. First, what happens when the tests and the rich, thick information that comes from a teacher who's watched your kid over time with various projects, what happens when those two diverge? Are you more likely to trust what the standardized test result says or what your teacher is saying based on her knowledge over time? And if you are going to ultimately trust the teacher, what added, which I hope is the answer, what added information is the standardized test giving you? What is it offering that's necessary to do beyond what authentic assessments and observations are providing over time? I think the answer to that was contained at the end of your remarks here, where you veered off into numerical comparisons. Now you're not asking, how's my kid learning? You're asking, is my kid beating a sufficient number of other kids who took this test? And that may not be your primary consideration, but that's the only thing that a standardized test provides us with beyond the much richer, more substantive, and I think more valid kinds of assessments that the teacher is able to do. If a parent says, I want to make sure my kid's doing okay, that's a perfectly legitimate question. A parent who wants to know, how's my kid doing compared to everyone else? That is an illegitimate question, and any attempts to answer it end up reducing the quality of education for everyone.
I have to butt in
Go
here.
ahead.
I am a parent, so it's interesting to say that it's
Me
an
too.
illegitimate question.
I've had 2 kids go up through this
Right?
system.
Yeah.
Sure. So it's not an illegitimate question to me, and it's not an illegitimate question to the vast majority of Americans when you poll the public.
In this
about
super competitive country, that's what most people are asking about. Ultimately, is my kid beating other kids?
That's not the question that I'm asking. When I look at that comparative data, is not, is my kid beating these other kids? Is my kid pulverizing these kids? Is my kid winning in this, race? It's a sense of, hey, how's he doing relative to his peers? It's the same
relative
thing. Hold on. When I go to the doctor, I like to get the height and weight and percentile rank of my kids. One of my kids is really small. He's really short. He's really thin. I want to know that.
Let me extend that, Jeff.
That's a comparison. And if you don't have that in academics, you are missing out on vital information.
There's a normal range too. So let's talk for a second about diabetes. If you have low blood sugar, you're below a certain, that's a problem. If you have high blood sugar, that's a problem. When you visit the doctor, there is a normal range. There's a high normal and a low normal. That's not a competitive thing. I'm not trying to compete against others on my blood sugar. But it's very comforting for me to know that I'm in the range I ought to be. And when I see that my blood sugar is a little too high, I can take remedial action. It may take me a while to do that, but I take remedial action. So that's not a competitive thing.
No, in that example, I think you're right. That does not necessitate competition. In an educational context, though, it is not too difficult to see this under the surface the competitive concerns that have more to do with winning than just reassurance. And one way you see that is when you see how disanalogous the process of learning is, as I mentioned before, to something like diabetes. To question the analogy itself, what happens if the teacher says, I can provide you with qualitative, not quantitative, but qualitative feedback and information to let you know, here is an area to be concerned, and in these areas, you need not be concerned at all. And let me describe what I've noticed about what your kid is learning and how and all the rest of that. If a parent is satisfied with that, which he or she ought to be, if indeed just being reassured that there's no reason to be concerned was all that was going on, then we're fine. But a parent who pushes and say, but I need relative information, now I think that parent may have inadvertently revealed something about his or her real motives. Otherwise, why would we need this relative information?
Okay, let me give you an answer.
Can I?
Because the Gunning Fog Index that my kid's writing is coming out is a 7, but they're a high school junior. They're not scoring as high when the work is analyzed, and there's any number of different indices related to that are helpful. This kid
helpful toward answering what question?
Is my kid doing a sufficient amount of work, good work, productive work in improving his writing, her writing? Like it's helpful.
The writing.
I'm sorry?
Read the writing. Why do you need to reduce that to a numerical term, let alone a comparative numerical term?
Okay.
Well,
we've all done a lot of writing, the people here, yes? Sometimes you go, I don't know if people are going to get it. I might need to simplify that. Yeah. One of the things I do is I put it through a filter like Gunning Fog to try to get a sense of where am I? Am I using too many big words? Are the sentences too complex? And you can use that in other ways. It's a tool. And of course, as a tool, it can be misused. And I tend to agree that this has become wildly misused. But let's not dismiss all the tools because they do have purposes. But they have to be properly managed.
Fall into the trap of saying tools are neutral and it's all a matter of how they're implemented, where we can use them badly or well. Many tools, and we're learning this increasingly about technology, have inherent properties that affect the outcomes themselves and are based upon certain premises that are baked into them. That's the case with standardized tests, I believe. But here I'm trying to play angel's advocate here in pressing us to reflect on what has come to become the conventional wisdom. Standardized tests are fine as long as they don't do them badly, don't overdo them, don't attach high stakes. They provide some useful information. And I think the more you press on that in terms of the criteria, the premises, the qualitative assumptions about learning that standardized tests are only as good as, raise questions about the very nature of these things. They may not be tools at all, at least in the metaphorical sense of that being something that helps us build. You know, there are books out about how great writing teachers would never use a numerical rubric to help kids get better at their writing because those kids will always end up focusing on how good am I at meeting the specific criteria of the rubric to the exclusion of the things that come from a much richer, more authentic sense of how does a wider audience of readers respond to what it is that you've written, which is not only sufficient, so you don't need tests, it's better than any test that reduces writing to numbers can ever be.
Let me make a really brief point here. I think, you know, Alfie, I have enormous respect for teachers, and I think most of them are very insightful and give very helpful feedback. But there's a couple issues here. One is that we're asking teachers to be enormously cognizant of all the different elements that make up whatever domain it is that they're teaching. And that's a tall order. But I would also wonder that we talk about test bias, there's also bias on the part of teachers. There's enormous bias on the part of middle-class teachers towards low-income kids.
Yes.
Well-documented bias on the part of many white teachers to Black and brown kids. And if you're going to invest in, if you're going to orient your entire assessment system around teacher information and feedback,
yes,
you're opening yourself up to a number of extremely, potentially extremely damaging propositions in terms of prejudice and discrimination.
No, understood. Although that doesn't begin to even be a fraction of the bias, racial, class, and gender bias built into all standardized tests that have.
Let me stop there for a second, because I was going to end this, but Nicholas just chatted in a question that I like a lot. However, we just got a note from Steve saying, because of their different perspectives, this has probably been my favorite episode. So good, we got a good assessment, right? However, Nicholas,
I want a grade.
Yeah, exactly.
We're going to in a minute.
How stupid would it be to give a numerical rating after that, right?
We might. Nicholas says, however, they didn't share anything that would be helpful to reinvent assessment in schools, since everything that was shared is about the current paradigm. So,
well, I very briefly, I only briefly mentioned that I've done a lot of writing on this, as have a number of others. The Coalition of Essential Schools, with their talk about exhibitions of mastery, talk about the Performance Assessment Consortium of mostly African-American Latino public schools in New York City, where they stay away from standardized tests, and the kids have to demonstrate their understanding in what's very comparable at the end of high school to defending a doctoral dissertation. The Met School, where kids have to go out in the community and demonstrate their ability to use what they know. Portfolios, which I mentioned.
Right. But
there's a huge range.
Apart from the examples, if you could, very briefly, if you could change, reinvent, not just incremental change.
Yeah. 3
core ideas about what we do to figure out how students are succeeding and where they need some help, what would you do?
Well, in terms of new policies that are enacted, or does getting rid of standardized tests count as one of them?
So it turns out that number 1, Biden won. Number 2, your Secretary of Education, with far more power than any Secretary of Education's ever had, you are now in charge. How do you want to do evaluation, assessment, testing, whatever you want to call it, for every student in the United States? Okay, go.
First, I do more asking than telling. That's what great classroom teachers do. That's certainly what I would hope a Secretary of Education does, to elicit what's already working. First, because it's more respectful. Second, because it produces a lot more great ideas than I could come up with individually. And third, because I don't want to reinvent the wheel. I just rattled off a couple of amazing pilot experiments now going on that could indeed be used more widely. But look, when every politician, including Obama and Biden, not just the Republicans, talks about education itself in terms of economics and competitiveness, how we can be more globally competitive in the economic worldwide marketplace, which is what they all tend to do. And
what do you want to do? I understand the criticism. You're Secretary of Education.
What I want to do is begin a conversation about why we have schools in the first place, because you're not going to make changes in just assessment by itself until we've made it clear that the point of education is to help kids realize their potential and build or rescue a faltering democracy, not merely help kids become more skilled employees in the future who raise the profitability of their future employers. So until we've rethought what the point of education is, it's going to be hard to do that. Beyond that, I would use a number of the things that were experimented on with in the 45-minute window in the early 90s, when some states like California and Arizona and Maryland and Nebraska were playing around with meaningful, authentic alternatives to standardized assessment, in which we could have a number of different criteria of kids' assignments over time to get a sense of not just how the kid is doing, but to be that check on teacher bias that Jeff mentioned, and the fact that even if teachers don't you know, don't have a clear traditional sense of bias in favor of boys or white people. Each one is just one person.
Right.
It gives you a sense of sharing it so other people weigh in on this. There are ways to do it without ever quantifying, and people have already showed us how to do it.
Now, I just got a text from the future, and it turns out that you've done such a good job in education, they're moving you to HHS. So Jeff, you're now the Secretary of Education. What are you going to do?
Well, I think the one thing that I would start with, just sort of pointing out and broadcasting across the country and in discussions with state departments of education, is that if you look at the U.S. education system from virtually any other country, our unique or at least distinctive system of federalism and states' rights creates a pretty remarkable diversity in terms of assessment strategies that some would say is verging on incoherent, right? So you have 50 different states, you have 50 different assessment kinds. And I think just starting there would be helpful, because if you are in charge, you're looking out and you're trying to get a read on the state of education across the United States. You're getting 50 different streams of information that is very hard to really comprehend and put in conversation with one another.
So you need to standardize it. I'm tongue in cheek, right? So here's
That's what we tried with the Common Core, which is a disaster on so many levels.
So let me ask one final question of the several of us. How'd we do? We just spent an hour together, a little more than an hour. What do you think? How would you assess it?
I can tell you whether I had a good time or learned anything, but I'd be more interested in the responses, the qualitative, not quantitative responses of as many people as possible who listened to us. That's how we did. When I visit a school and I do a workshop and I come home and maybe my kid asks me, hey, how'd it go with your talk in that school district? My answer is, I don't know. I have to go back in 6 months and see if any of the classrooms changed. You know, the fact that I entertained them is irrelevant.
You got a little bit of Let's Not Judge the Broadway Musical in the story in there somewhere. How did you do? Did you learn anything?
Did I personally learn anything? Yeah, I did. I mean, I have to say that I've been talking about these issues for a quarter of a century now. I've heard most of the arguments before. I like the way Jeff framed them and framed the distinction between them and pushed back at me. But if I'm being honest, did I hear an idea I'd never heard before about evaluation that I'm going to go look up? Not thinking of anything.
Okay,
But it was
that's
just
your criteria. That's fine. Jeff?
Yeah, no, I'd like to look through the chat thread and see what kinds of questions people posed. That would be interesting to me. Were the things we missed or things that they wanted us to amplify, and just to get a read on the virtual room, as Alfie mentioned. I do think there's something extremely interesting about Alfie's point of view, which when I teach his work with my students is something that always comes up, which is that, Alfie used the word radical, and I think he is a true radical. And one of the things that I think is interesting is that all of his ideas about assessment and evaluation and testing go well beyond the educational system to become a kind of critique of US politics, economy, and culture. So to me, I think it's always important to remind ourselves, why is schooling such a big deal? Why do we have the show called Reinventing School? Why do we focus so much on public education in the United States? Because it touches on these huge questions about citizenship, about the purpose of a democracy. And so to me, it's refreshing to always have that reminder. And I think that Alfie does a superb job of asking us to think about those big questions.
And two quick things about that. One, radical doesn't just mean extremist. I'm using radical in the original Latin sense of the word, meaning coming from the root. You're not just asking about the implementation of something, you're asking the root questions. Does it make sense to do it all? Mm-hmm. And second, while I think you're right that I'm deliberately trying to connect education to the context in which it occurs, I want to be careful that we don't get into the the moderates trap of saying, well, that all sounds well and good, and when we have completely reformed our economic and political system, then we can talk about getting rid of standardized tests or whatever. I think it's critical to say that even while we continue to work on the bigger political and social issues, radical changes can and should be made just within education too.
So radical has the same Latin root as radish, just by the way. But,
really?
I looked this
now
up.
I learned something.
Yes, there you go. And also eradicate,
Uh-huh.
which I think is fascinating, right? So if we take that to kind of frame this even a little more, it doesn't sound to me, Alfie, as though what you're saying is radical. It sounds to me like what you're saying is reasonable. And
Well,
that
those aren't opposites.
well, but in some way, so the way all of this has evolved feels to me to be so different from purpose and intention that when you talk about reasonable, you seem radical. That's unfortunate. And that's probably the place we can stop for the day, although after the credits, we can all hang out if you like. Thank you all. Thank you all very much. Thanks everybody for joining us and for the many comments that we've gotten along the way. Really cool conversation. Thank you. See you next week. Positive psychology, positive education next week.
For on-demand episodes and more, visit our website. Kids on Earth contains hundreds of video interviews with students from around the world. Learning Revolution is a global collaboration network for people who care about learning. Be sure to join us next Thursday for a new episode of Reinventing School. Thanks for watching.